The sea was lapping at the sand, and I could hear the waves roaring as they hit the shore. Birds tweeted and called around me while I walked down the beach on that warm, sunny morning. Everything was peaceful and tranquil, as it always was when I took my morning walk, until suddenly it wasn't. When I bent down to pick up a pretty piece of coral, my golden retriever, named Rufus, suddenly flew forward, snatching his lead out of my hand as he bolted ahead of me. I called his name so many times, but he didn't come back. All of a sudden, he stopped and started staring down at something in the sand. He was snuffling and moving pebbles around with his nose. Then he started barking loudly, and I was totally lost. I didn't understand why my dog was barking like a madman. I pinched myself just to check if I was dreaming, since it seemed totally bizarre. Rufus was usually such a good boy. I didn't understand why he was disobeying me all of a sudden. It wasn't like this was an unusual thing for us to do. We went to the beach twice a day for walks every day. We would always walk down the sand together while I collected any pretty shells I found along the way. You see, I did this because my mom and I were desperate for any extra cash we could get. So I started to make jewelry, which I could then sell at the local market every Sunday. But we were already almost finished with our walk, and I barely found anything good enough for us to use yet. It was really disappointing, and I didn't have time to deal with whatever issue Rufus suddenly decided to have. So I ran forward and grabbed him by the collar. "What the hell, Rufus?" I asked before I looked down and noticed why he was acting so freaky. There was something huge poking out from the sand that Rufus had dug up. At first, I just wanted to pull him away and go home because it stunk so bad. It was like vomit mixed with garbage. I had to pinch my nose to keep me from barfing. "Come on, Rufus, let's go," I told him as I tried to tug him away again, but he wouldn't budge. I sighed and shook my head. I moved away from the awful smell and decided to just let him have his fun and take him back once he got bored. But as time went on, Rufus didn't give up, and I really wanted to get home. "Fine, you win," I told him as I walked back over to him. I decided to take it home with us so that Rufus could play with it, and I could get back and get on with my homework. So I took off my jacket and wrapped up the awful-smelling rock. It was stupidly heavy, though, and I could barely lift it. But eventually, I managed to tuck it into my bag. As soon as Rufus saw that I had the mysterious gray thing, he ran up to me, and finally I was able to get home. I didn't think too much about the rock after that. I stuck it out in our backyard, where Rufus continued to sniff it and try to play with it for the rest of the day. But after that, it was pretty much gone from my head. It didn't help that I had far worse things to worry about. Because 6 months earlier, my dad had left my mom for another woman. He moved across the country, and we hadn't heard from him since. My mom and I couldn't really afford the rent on my childhood home, so we were selling everything we owned to try and get the money every month, but we were running out of things to sell. The day after Rufus and I found that strange rock on the beach, my mom showed me a letter that made my blood run cold. It was an eviction notice. I couldn't believe it. My heart felt like it shattered into a million pieces. Not only had I lost my father, but now I was losing my home. My whole world felt like it was falling apart. Everything happened so quickly then. My mom and I had to pack up the little belongings we had left and found a shelter that had room to take us in. I know it seems stupid, but I brought the rock with me, since my dog had been so fond of it. So all I had left in the world was my mom, my dog, some clothes, and this stupid rock. The shelter wasn't exactly amazing, but it was nice to have a roof over our heads and somewhere comfortable to sleep. It beat sleeping on the streets, that's for sure. The people there were super weird, though. A lot of them clearly had mental health problems that they weren't getting any help for. Sometimes I woke up in the night to hear them screaming. But one day, an old man with a horrible cough stumbled into our room in the morning and stood there just staring down at my dog. I was super freaked out and cuddled up to my mom, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't. "What are you staring at?" I asked him. He pointed down at the rock my dog was curled up with. I couldn't believe that was what he was looking at. It was so stupid. I laughed. As a joke, I asked if he wanted to buy it from me. Straight away, the man's eyes lit up and he started nodding. I thought he was just another crazy homeless guy. So I laughed, and my mom did too, until he started getting angry at us. He started telling us that he wanted it, and he pulled money from his pocket, trying to hand it over to us. It was strange that he was so insistent, and that he had so much money at a homeless shelter. I asked him who he was, and he said he was there to visit someone. I was surprised. He wasn't a crazy, homeless man after all, and he was really interested in my dog's weird rock. "I'll give you $500 for it," he told me, and I had to stop my jaw from dropping. "How about 1,000? I replied, thinking I would scare him off or he would stop teasing me. The man nodded and started pulling more cash out of his wallet. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't a joke, and that man was really trying to buy the rock for $1,000. What did he know about the rock that I didn't? It was getting creepy and weird, so I ended up telling the guy to leave. He protested at first and told me I should take the money since I was homeless. I almost caved right then and there. After all, $1,000 could get us an apartment for a month together, but something just didn't feel right. I needed to find out what on earth this rock was, and fast. So, I packed it in my bag one day and took it over to my friend Joe's house. He's a bit of a science geek, and he knows a lot about the ocean. I thought maybe he could help me, but when I took it out, Joe didn't have the faintest clue about what it might be. We checked his books about the sea for a while and tried to identify whether it was some kind of precious stone or gem, but it didn't match anything we found. Feeling sad and hopeless, I went back to the shelter, and I had the biggest shock ever. My mom was sat in the middle of the room, crying and hugging my dog. Everything in our room had been torn apart, tipped over and ripped. Our beds were covered in feathers, and our clothes were strewn across the room. I just didn't understand what happened, and my mom was too upset to explain anything. One of the wardens at the shelter came to check on us and help us get everything back to the way it was. Well, at least as much as they could. When I asked them what had happened while I was gone, they said that it looked like we had been robbed. I was so confused. Why would anyone rob us? We were living in a shelter. We wouldn't be here if we had any money. The warden said that people can get desperate, and maybe they thought we had something worth selling, and that's when it hit me. It had to be the strange rock, right? There was just no other explanation. I needed to find out more. So I went back to Joe and asked him to hide the rock at his house for me while I investigated. I didn't want to risk it getting stolen. Joe agreed, and we started to delve deeper into the internet. Joe ended up searching for similar stories to mine in local newspapers, and what we found changed everything. Joe said that every few years, people have found horrible-smelling rocks in the sand, which have been worth a lot of money. He found a picture of a woman holding one that was way smaller than mine, and it said that hers sold for $10,000. Apparently, it was called ambergris, and it was actually whale vomit. Ew! I couldn't believe I'd been carrying around whale vomit. It was so bizarre. That's when I started to think that it had to be some kind of joke. But when Joe showed me the proof, I almost fainted. Joe and I decided to contact some businesses online to get an estimate for what it was worth. Since we had such a huge piece, lots of people came from all over the state to inspect it. After a few days, I started getting crazy offers to buy a mysterious rock. One person offered $300,000 for it. Then the next offered $400,000. Joe and I were absolutely shocked. I didn't know what to do. This sort of money would change my life, but I didn't want to rush into anything. I told them I needed to think about it. I wanted to tell my mom, but I didn't want her to get her hopes up, and I thought maybe it would be a nice surprise for her. As I was entering the shelter that night, I was confronted by the strange old man again. This time, however, he didn't want to talk. He ran straight for me and grabbed my bag. He ripped it off my arm and searched inside it. "Where is it, little girl?" he snapped at me. I knew he wanted the ambergris, and I was so glad I'd left it at Joe's to keep it safe. "I've sold it. You'll never get it," I told him. That's when he went crazy. He surged forward and tried to grab me. I screamed and closed my eyes, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes to see something amazing. Rufus had run out and jumped on the old man, knocking him unconscious. He had protected me from him. I raced toward him and hugged him close. I told him he was such a good boy, and I really meant it. Right from the start, Rufus had been looking after me, and he'd even found a way for Mom and me to make the money we needed to be secure again. The shelter called the police. After I told them I was almost assaulted, the man was taken away and told he was never allowed in the shelter again. I was so relieved, but I still had the ambergris to sell. The next day, I decided I wanted to get it over and done with. I checked my emails, and just as I was about to accept the offer for $400,000, my phone beeped. It was another email from a perfume company. They wanted to buy the rock for $500,000! I couldn't believe it! I cried with happiness and accepted. So, what did you think of my story? Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content.
I was always a daddy's girl growing up. My dad and I did everything together, but it got to me to end up calling a stranger to our home just to get back at my stepmother. I can't remember exactly how my family imploded, but my mom found out my dad was having an affair with this woman, Helen. Then my dad left my mom for Helen. Then, worst of all, he proposed to Helen before the divorce was even finalized. I was devastated. I knew I would never really trust my father again. I convinced myself that Helen had manipulated my dad. He never would have done this to my mom and me if she hadn't sunk her claws into him. I hated her with every fiber of my being. I looked forward to the moment my dad would ask me to live with him after the divorce. I imagined all the ways I would tell him no, that he was a liar, and I wouldn't live with him for $1 million. But he never asked. Just accepted a custody deal where he got me every other weekend. I was stunned and so hurt. He didn't even want me? He would rather have Helen than his own daughter? My first few visits to his new house were awful. Being in the same room as Helen made me see red. She was loud, annoying, and took up all my dad's attention. She would talk about all the bad Tinder dates she'd been on before she'd finally met my dad at the grocery store. Like meeting a married guy and stealing him away from his family was cute. I wanted to find a way to get my dad to break up with her and go back to being my dad. I was talking to my friend about the situation, and she had a great idea. She said I should reactivate Helen's Tinder profile and convince my dad she was unfaithful. That seemed like a great way to both get back at my dad and to get Helen out of the picture. Getting into Helen's Tinder account wasn't hard. I knew her email, and she's the kind of person who uses the word password as her password. I made a few updates to her profile, posted some new pictures, and voila! Within minutes, she was getting messages from guys, which I replied to. There was one guy, Bill, who really took a shining to Helen. I thought it was hilarious to flirt with him. He lived alone and seemed like a total weirdo. He wanted to meet in person, but I kept telling him I wasn't ready yet. He said he understood, and he kept pouring out his soul to me. He said he felt like we were soulmates. I tried not to crack up. I felt like a spy. My friend asked why I kept checking my phone at lunch. I told her I was Tinder flirting with Bill, and she was like, okay, but weren't you just going to use this as a way to get your dad to break up with Helen? I mean, technically now you're catfishing. It was your idea, I told her, a little hurt. I know, she said, but you seem to be taking it really far. Whatever. I love this. Soon I would make sure to leave Helen's Tinder profile on the computer for my dad to discover. But one day, I logged on and I had a new message from Bill. If I don't meet you in person, I'm going to die, he said. I messaged back trying to make light of it, saying that I really needed to get to know somebody before I met with them. He replied, I'm across the street from you right now, LOL. I freaked out. Was he serious? What are you talking about, I asked. He said, I did some research and I figured out where you live. Don't be afraid of your feelings, Helen. I need to see your beautiful face in person. Then I really freaked. Was he a serial killer? What had I done? And how was I going to fix this without my dad finding out? I peeked out the window. There was a car idling across the street. Heart pounding, I messaged Bill that I didn't want to talk anymore. If you break up with me, he wrote back, I'll hurt myself. He couldn't be serious. We didn't even know each other. We weren't dating. We never even met in person. But I realized that this guy was actually crazy enough to do something terrible. I thought about calling my friend and asking advice, but I was still kind of hurt by her accusing me of catfishing. Bill said, I'm going to come to your door unless you tell me not to. But if you tell me not to, maybe life isn't worth living. I told myself to just tell him not to. His mental illness wasn't my problem. But what if he really did something to himself, and all because I had played a prank on him? It's over, I wrote. Don't contact me again. Too late, he answered. I started having a panic attack. My dad came in and found me shaking and in tears and asked what was wrong. I didn't want to tell him, but somehow the whole story came pouring out. He immediately went outside. I went to the window and saw him beside the car parked on the street. He was shouting at the driver, then trying to reach into the window. The car sped off, tires squealing. Dad stormed back in. Was that Bill? I asked. What did you do to him? I told him never to show his face anywhere near my house again. He whirled on me. Do you have any idea what you've done? How dangerous that was? What if he had tried to hurt you? Or me, or Helen? I'd briefly ever heard my dad yell before, and definitely not at me. I didn't know what to say. Helen came in then and demanded to know what was going on. Tell her, said my dad. I was so humiliated and scared I couldn't speak. My dad finally got on the computer and pulled up Tinder, told me to log in. I did. Helen saw the profile that I had updated for her. She looked at the messages that I had sent to men. Then she straightened and told my dad she was going to stay with her mother. My dad demanded to know why, and she said she was not going to marry a man who had such a horrible daughter. I was so hurt and so angry. I knew that what I had done was wrong, but she was the one who had wrecked my family. I shouted at her. I don't even remember what I said. That's how upset I was. All I remember is that I ended up in my room crying into my pillow, and I heard Helen slam the front door and her car pull away. When I finally emerged from my room the next day, I was scared that my dad would still be furious, but he mostly just seemed tired. Without Helen around, he acted more like the dad I knew. How could you do that, was all he said. She took you away from Mom. She ruined our family. She's mean to me and I hate her. I miss you, and I hate how you like her better than me. I knew I sounded like a spoiled brat, but it was how I felt. To my surprise, my dad stood and hugged me. I don't think I realized how much you were hurting, he said. I didn't want to think about how my actions might have affected you. She just makes me happy. I told him I thought Mom had made him happy. He said people change. After that day, I waited. I kept expecting Helen every weekend I was at my dad's. She stayed gone. No word from my dad about where she was or what was happening between them. Finally, I gathered my courage and asked him. He said he and Helen weren't going to get married after all. He said I was his first priority, not Helen. I was in shock. I should have been so excited, but I felt guilty instead. Over the next few days, guilt continued to shadow me. My friend was excited, singing ding dong, the witch is dead, and stuff. But I knew the truth, that I'd taken away my dad's happiness. What if he resented me forever? But I couldn't make myself apologize. Couldn't make myself tell him he could marry Helen if he wanted. Instead, I slipped into a new Helen-free life, and I enjoyed it so much. Without her around, my dad actually wanted to go out to do things we both liked. He felt like my dad again. But one day, I came home to find Helen in the living room. I was shocked, but then angry. My dad took me aside and said that he and Helen were getting back together. I went numb. I asked if I could go to my mom's house, but my dad said no. I had to stay here and talk. He explained that Helen was who he'd chosen, and I'd have to learn to be okay with that. Okay with the woman who called me his horrible daughter? No way! I started for the door. He asked me where I was going, and I told him that I was going to live with my mother full time. I'll talk to her, Helen told him as she followed me to my room. I felt disgusted as I heard her walking to my room. I want to talk to you, honey, she said with her ugly voice as she opened the door and let herself in. But suddenly her facial expressions changed and her tone became very harsh. Listen, you brat, she screamed. You might not like me, and trust me, I don't like you either. But know that if you ever mess up my relationship again, I will mess up your life. And with that, she left my room without even giving me a chance to argue. I wanted to cry. How the hell did I end up having this witch as a stepmother? Of course, none of her threats were going to scare or stop me. I wasn't going to give up and just let her take my mother's place. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual because I wanted to get my coffee and breakfast before Helen woke up. To my luck, I found her standing in the kitchen making herself coffee. She said good morning, but I didn't reply, and I went ahead to make my own coffee. But she didn't let it go. I said good morning, you brat, as she blocked my way to the coffee machine and took my empty cup. No coffee for you this morning, dear. I couldn't believe she was acting like this. I leaned over quickly to take my cup from her, but she moved her hand fast and the cup fell on the floor and broke into pieces. With all this noise, my father hurried to the kitchen and asked what was happening. When he came in, Helen looked at him and cried, "She tried to throw glass at me!" I looked at my father as I was shaking my head and told him that it wasn't true. But instead of believing me, he asked me to go to my room. I went to my room crying, feeling abandoned by my dad. However, after 2 hours had passed, I was shocked to hear Helen leaving the house with her stuff, and then my dad came in and told me that he heard what happened in the kitchen and that he was sorry. Did you like my story? Please let me know if you've been through something similar. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.